Thank you so much, Janet, for these very kind words of introduction. I was going to say good afternoon, I was going to say good evening, ladies and gentlemen, but actually it's good afternoon. And it's really my pleasure to be here today to speak at the annual general meeting of ICMA. As Janet has just said, I've been a corporate lawyer for about 9 years, and I've worked essentially on equity capital markets, but as you may know, a trainee works on everything in the beginning, and so I have done some debt capital markets and discovered your world at the time. And I know since a long time, and especially from my current functions, how important you are in the capital markets. I've been told that there's an electoral campaign outside this room. I don't know if you've heard about it. There are elections on 9 June in Belgium. So from those who come from Europe, from abroad, it's the European elections, but not only. We also have regional and federal elections in this country. And so it's a moment where you hear a lot of fairy tales, actually. As far as I'm concerned, my story does not change during the electoral campaign, and it's not so much a story of a fairy tale as State Secretary for Budget. It's more of a wake-up call. A wake-up call about numbers, about the challenges ahead, about what we need to do. And it's my story on the budget. I think you are all people who like and understand numbers, and it's about the Belgian story of the budget. I think it may be of interest also to the international colleagues, because in Belgium, we have a deficit in 2023. We also will have a deficit for the year 2024. But we're not the only ones, as in 2023, we have 7 European colleagues who have a greater deficit than Belgium. So it may also echo with other countries. It may be of interest. And it's about how our fiscal, our budgetary challenges are structural, and how without deep reforms in this country to our pension system, to our taxation system, to activation policies, to our healthcare system, well, we are heading for a wall. So let me give you a little idea of the numbers and of where our deficit comes from. I'll start my story with a figure, and that figure is 160 billion euros. 160 billion euros, those are the tax and non-tax revenues of the federal state in 2023. I think you all know what the tax revenues are: personal income tax, corporate tax, VAT, etc., 152 billion euros. And then the non-fiscal revenues, and this is the official moment that I will take to thank you, the banks, for your contribution not only to the fiscal revenues, but some of you to our non-fiscal revenues. So if we have representatives in the room of BNP Paribas or of Belfius, thank you very much, deeply appreciated. So it's a huge amount actually of revenues, but before we've made any policy decision, before we've even discussed about policy choices, I have to, by law, redistribute about 135 billion euros of this. So who does that money go to? Well, it goes to several purposes. 77 billion euros go to the regions and the communities in Belgium. So the federal state sends them to Flanders, Brussels, Wallonia, the German community, the French community, and that's on the basis of the special financing law. And then about 50 billion euros goes to the social security, because the social security in Belgium is financed by the social contributions, so by the people who work. But today, the social contributions are no longer self-sustaining for the social security system, as they finance only 58% of our social security. Actually, if I'm complete, the social security is financed, self-financed with 64% of revenues in total. So it still means that there's a gap of about 1/3 of the revenues, and so we need to go and get that 1/3 of revenues, not in the social contributions, but in tax revenues. You may tell me it's almost the same thing, almost, because those taxes, which is withholding tax, VAT, were actually had another purpose, were actually planned to finance other expenditures. And so because the law says the social security must always be in balance, I think that's a very fine law. I would actually really approve of it for the budget in itself. Well, we have a complement that comes from the tax revenues. And then the last deduction is I pay 8 billion euros to Europe. That's our GDP contributions. It's also custom rights that we send back to the European Union. Every member state pays these contributions, and we obviously get something back from Europe. So what does this mean in practice? Well, if you followed, I'm left with 25 billion euros, of which I need to deduct the interest payment of the debt, of the interest charges on our debt, and that's 8.6 billion euros in 2023, 10 billion in 2024, and it's going to rise to 15 billion, about 15 billion in 2028. So I'm left with 16.5 billion euros to finance 36 billion primary expenditures. So what are we talking about? What are primary expenditures? It's actually the core business of the federal state. We're talking about defense, police, diplomacy, justice, asylum and migration, scientific policy, the payment of all civil servants. And so, as you understand, before we've made any policy choice, I start my budget with a deficit of 20 billion euros. And that's the challenge that is ahead, and it shows that it is structural. It's not that we're throwing the money out through windows and doors, it's that we need to reform our system, and in particular, our social security, if we want to go back to a budget and balance. And you probably all know how important it's going to be in the coming years, since Europe has adopted new budgetary rules under the Belgian presidency, actually. And people ask me all the time, so are these rules stricter than the actual rules? No, they're not stricter. They're just much clearer. We're still working with the 3% of the Maastricht norm. We're still working with the 60% debt rule, except that here we'll have to go back to 3% deficit, and then in a second stage to 1.5%, which is an extra buffer. But to be honest, in the previous regime, we actually already had an MTO, a medium-term objective, and we were all supposed to go back to a balance at some point in time, so that's not a huge difference. And the good news is we get 4 years to put the budget on track, but if we invest, if we reform, and that's where these rules are more tailor-made to each member state, we can get even 7 years. Last element, and that is new, is that there is now an expenditure norm, which says that the expenditures may not rise more rapidly than a certain formula that's calculated by Europe on the basis of growth. And I think that's good news, because the problem of our budget is not so much on the revenue side, but on the expenditure side. And it's definitely the aging costs that are increasing our deficit year after year. And so what does that mean concretely for Belgium? It means that we're going to have to do an effort of about 25 billion euros over 5 years' time, meaning 5 billion a year, approximately. That sounds like a big number. The good news is that's nothing we haven't done. We've done such an effort for 2024. We've done an effort of 5 billion euros, which means that it is possible and that we can do it. And I guess the question is then, how are we going to do it? Well, what do? More taxes? Bold savings? Well, there are voices that are arguing that the cuts need to come in the primary expenditures and that can reduce the deficit. As I mentioned, if you look at the total of all federal spending, excluding Social Security, interest payments and transfers, it represents about 36.5 billion euros, about 6% of GDP. So it's impossible to eliminate the budget deficit merely by cutting current spending, especially when you know that we're going to have to reinvest in such departments like defense, security, justice, whose budgets are expected to increase rather to decrease. And in addition, interest costs will also increase rather than decrease, as I told you, 15 billion by 2028. So that's not an option. Some are saying that we need to reduce the deficit by higher taxes. And that's actually a campaign theme for many parties. How do we tax more? The creativity is endless. It's amazing. Well, I've had a look at the OECD figures, and I think they speak for themselves. For a single person without children with an average wage, the tax burden in Belgium in 2022 was as high as 53%. Belgium is the only industrial country where more than half of gross wages are skimmed off. So if you look at the tax burden for a single person without children in the Netherlands, for example, I don't know if there are Netherlands colleagues in the room, it's only 35.5%, which is slightly above the OECD average of 34.6%. So I don't think taxing people who work is going to be a solution. Others would like to refer to an additional tax on capital and wealth. Well, unfortunately, I have to tell you that Belgium is already de facto heavily taxed on that as well. If we look at tax revenue from capital, we rank number 3. We've got the bronze medal. If we look at the implicit taxation of capital, so withholding tax, transaction taxes, we've got the silver medal. We're in the second place. These are not my calculations, by the way. It has been the numbers published by the European Commission. And even our Federal Plan Bureau has published a report saying in 2023 that the millionaire's tax may not be such a good idea because it brings a lot of uncertainty about the amount of revenue that is never as high as people think it is, that it's very complex to estimate each family's net worth and administratively expensive. If we look at OECD countries, there were 12 or 13 countries who had a wealth tax, and today there are only 3 that are left. Why? Well, probably because it's not that effective, and we see that capital is extremely mobile and moves away. So it's not the income that's the problem, as I told you, it's the expenses. What about our social security? Seems like an uncomfortable topic for some, but I think it's really essential to talk about it precisely because we have an amazing system of social security. I've had the great luck to live in the US, an absolutely amazing country, a great spirit of entrepreneurship. But honestly, I don't know if we have Americans in the room, I don't envy your social security system. We have an absolutely amazing system in Belgium, be it for healthcare, be it for long-term sick, be it for unemployment, maybe sometimes too generous for some things, but that's what we need to protect. So what do we see for our pensions? That the aging report of the European Commission for 2021 is showing that pension spending will rise to 15% of GDP in around 2040. If you look at pensions between 2020 and 2028, they rise from 50 billion to 80 billion euros. That's an increase of more than 50%. If we want to protect our pension system, we will need to reform it. Even the IMF was clear. The IMF tells us, Belgium, you have a great healthcare system. It's fantastic what you do in terms of healthcare. But if we compare you to other countries, you should be 20 to 30% less expensive. So real reforms are really necessary. How are we going to do it? We need to increase our employment rate significantly to reach the 80% of employment rate. We're around the 74% today, and it's essentially Flanders that is pulling the rest of the country to that height, to that amount. And why is it so important? Because we have 1.3 million people who are inactive in Belgium, of which 500,000 long-term sick, 300,000 are unemployed, and 500,000 for whatever reason choose not to work. If we could activate just 200,000 of those people, the Federal Plan Bureau tells us that it's 28,000 per person that goes back to work. So that's 5.6 billion euro that falls just in the laps of the state, and that's the easiest and less painful way to get revenues. Let's also have a debate around the core tasks of the government. What do we need to do? Having healthy finances is also wondering, what are the tasks of the state? What are tasks that must be done by the private sector? Let me end by telling you that under this government, we have actually taken a step forward towards sound public finances, because we have also respected our commitments to Europe in the stability program, and we have set a trajectory that we have for 2024 respected, because we have done an additional effort. According to some, it's too small a step. Yes, but regardless and relevant, a challenging step, and definitely when you have 7 governmental parties in a government. So much for my story for today. As I told you in the introduction, it's a wake-up story, but it's also a story of hope. We can do this. The challenges are possible, and I do believe that we have an opportunity with the beginning of the next government to do the reforms that we need to do for the next generation and to protect our amazing system. And so I hope that it may also inspire other countries who are faced with the same budgetary problems, because we know that it is something that is living in many Western democracies today. I wish you a very inspiring afternoon, and thank you very much for your attention.